Welcome to the Radically Genuine podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin. In an era where truth often seems obscured by a fog of corporate interests and institutional power, the work of independent journalists and ethical practitioners becomes a beacon of light during these dark times. These intrepid seekers of truth stand as the last line of defense against a tide of misinformation that threatens to engulf us all. Today, we find ourselves facing a crisis of epic proportions in the field of mental health, one that strikes at the very heart of scientific integrity and public trust. Despite mounting evidence of widespread fraud and misconduct in antidepressant research, an alarming number of medical professionals continue to operate behind what can be only described as a pharmaceutical iron curtain. Every day, countless patients are prescribed powerful psychotropic drugs based on studies now known to be manipulated and misleading. This is not merely academic dishonesty. It's a betrayal of public trust with potentially devastating consequences for millions of lives. The story of how antidepressants came to dominate the mental health landscape is one of corporate greed, scientific malfeasance, and regulatory failure. It's a tale that desperately needs telling and one that cuts to the core of how we as a society approach mental health and human suffering. In times like these, we owe a debt of gratitude to those rare journalists who dare to challenge the status quo, who risk professional ostracism and personal attacks to bring hidden truths to light. Their courage and commitment to uncovering the facts, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient, serve as a vital safeguard for public health, democratic values, and medical freedom. Today, we are honored to speak with one such journalist, a man whose relentless pursuit of the truth has shed light on one of the most pressing medical controversies of our time. I'm honored today to have Robert Whitaker on the podcast, an American journalist and author who has won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for medical writing and the National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. In 1998, he co-wrote a series on psychiatric research for the Public Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for public service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover Magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. He is the publisher for Mad in America. Many people are quite aware of his work. I hope I'm introducing others around the globe to him for the first time. Robert Whitaker, welcome to the Radically Genuine podcast.
Well, thank you for that very nice and generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you. I mean, first, let's just start off. There might be listeners who are not familiar with you or your work. So if you can just share a bit about your professional background and really how you became what I think is the preeminent critic of contemporary psychiatry.
Well, thank you. Yes, I have a very conventional background in terms of how I came to this, to start writing about psychiatry. So I was a newspaper journalist for a number of years. And then eventually within that career, I was moved to the beat of covering medicine and science, which I did for a number of years. Now, I was doing that at the Albany Times-Union newspaper. And I have to tell you, one of the things, I was writing a lot of features. And a lot of what you do when you're a features reporter covering medicine and science is you sort of celebrate those two, findings in those two areas. However, I did in early 1992, I began changing my coverage and my thinking. And it was because I did a series on the introduction of laparoscopic surgery for gallbladders. Now, it's always done that way today, okay? But at the time, they screwed it up, the introduction, because the doctors did not get proper training. Why didn't they get proper training? Because there was this competition among medical centers to be the first to have this new way of doing surgery. Plus, the makers of the laparoscopic tools would run these weekend training camps where certain surgeons would go, do it on a pig, and then come back and do it on a human being, and they botched it. There was a number of deaths in New York State related to this introduction of this therapy. And what I learned there was the financial influences affecting medicine, because there were stocks being sold and stock prices going up by the laparoscopic makers of those tools. And this competition about medical centers to be seen as on the cutting edge of science. So all of a sudden I began seeing medicine as not just this pure science, but it had this financial influence. Go forward, I eventually had a brief time as director of publications at the Harvard Medical School. I had left daily journalism. Now, this was interesting for this reason. This was in the mid-1990s, real briefly. And at this time was when evidence-based medicine was all the rage. It was being introduced. We sometimes think, oh, evidence-based medicine has always been with us. This idea that clinicians, doctors, and others have to follow the evidence really became under a new wave in the early 1990s, okay? It became a term applied. Now, one of the ideas about evidence-based medicine is that doctors can be deluded about their merits of their therapies, and you have to have this third-party look at things, okay? So one of the reason I mention this is this put me in a position of thinking that doctors can say something is helpful, but maybe it really isn't if you really look at the evidence. So it made me not just trust what the experts were telling me, but also what you could be finding in the scientific literature. Now, I actually had no interest in psychiatry per se. My next stage was this. I co-founded a company called Center Watch. And Center Watch, we looked at the commercialization. Believe it or not, most of our customers were either doctors or pharmaceutical companies. And what was happening in the late 1990s, even before this, is pharmaceutical companies, to get their new drugs approved, rather than hire independent doctors who would design the trials, test the trials, write up the studies, they now had commercialized the testing of new drugs. You had something called contract research organizations. The pharmaceutical companies would they would be the ones that design the protocols, analyze the data. Either they would, or these contract research organizations, and they basically would write up the results, and they would have the academic doctors just sign their name as authors. So I co-founded this company that was just looking at this change from an academic enterprise into a business enterprise. It was called Center Watch. And while writing about that, it became evident that the testing of new drugs was no longer a scientific enterprise. It was a commercial enterprise. They were designing trials to make the new drugs look good rather than to really test their efficacy and safety. And the authors were being paid a lot of money to do this. So this became an experience over a 4-year period, which I became aware of the way that clinical tests of new drugs were commercial enterprises. They were marketing enterprises rather than scientific enterprises. And by the way, we got threatened with lawsuits for making this known. But where was the most visible example of this commercialization? It was in the trials of new psychiatric drugs, the antidepressants and the antipsychotics. So that's why I got interested in psychiatry, because of that corruption. Oh, and by the way, you would see trials in which the new drugs were being heralded as breakthrough medications, and you could do a Freedom of Information request and find out that like people had died on the drug in the trial, then on suicides, and that was never mentioned. Anyway, I did I'm obviously going on at some length here, but the important thing is I didn't start at this as a critic of psychiatry. I started at this as wanting to know the evidence base and becoming a critic of the commercialization, because I saw it was corrupting the science. And then finally what happened, though, was this. I did a series for the Boston Globe, which you mentioned was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in public service. And I still had a conventional understanding of psychiatric drugs that, say, for example, antipsychotics, they fixed a dopamine imbalance in the brain, okay? And my understanding was, because of that, and that's what all the experts told me, that these drugs were absolutely essential for people diagnosed with schizophrenia to stay on those drugs for life, okay? That was my understanding. And one part of the series, in fact, where we were looked at studies in which they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients to see how quickly they would relapse. And we said in our series that was unethical because I had been told the drugs were like insulin for diabetes. You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic to see how fast they became sick again and what were the consequences. So I still, even though I had this sense of corruption within psychiatry on the new drugs, I still believed this larger story about chemical imbalances and drugs fixing chemical imbalances. Two things happened that made me doubt that story of, and by the way, just to do this, that story of chemical imbalance is a story of great medical progress. Think about what it's telling us. It's telling us that they had discovered the very molecules that cause madness, the very molecule that caused depression, and they could fix it. But while doing that series for the Boston Globe, here's what happened. I came upon two studies that belied that story of progress, and then I got a book contract to write more about what these two studies told about. What were the two studies? One was a study done by Harvard researchers published in 1994 in which they looked at recovery rates over a long period of time, the past century, for schizophrenia patients. And what they found was, A, recovery rates for schizophrenia patients had actually declined in the last 20 years in the Western world, in the US and the Western world, and were now no better than in the first third of the 20th century. So we had been told the story of progress, but what the data was saying, there was, if anything, things were getting worse. And here was the second kicker. They had twice done studies comparing outcomes. This was the World Health Organization, by the way. Twice done studies comparing outcomes in three developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, for schizophrenia patients, compared to outcomes in the US and other developed countries. And one study was 2 years in length, one was 5 years in length. The first one was 5 years in length, and they came to the astonishing conclusion that outcomes were much better in the developing countries. So much so, they said that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, you'll have a bad outcome. Now, and I'm almost done with this long-winded answer, and then they do the second study and they hypothesize maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the developing countries is that people are more medication compliant. It's a valid hypothesis if the drugs are so essential. So they measure outcomes in the they measure medication use in the second study, and here's what they found. In the developing countries, they use the drugs acutely, but not chronically. Only a very small percentage were kept on the drugs long-term, where, of course, that's the standard of care in the United States. All of which to say is, once I investigated those studies, found out what was really in them, I said something's wrong with the narrative of progress that we are being told about advances in psychiatry. And that's what I investigated in Mad in America. And that's what me got started, was that we as a society were in some way organizing our thinking around a false narrative of progress.
Well said. And so that's really important that this story be told about how the narrative was originally created. So I want to start, we're going to start with just depression and the use of SSRIs. This goes back to 1987. Fluoxetine, which is known as Prozac, was brought to market, approved by the FDA. Kind of starts there. You and I are of a similar era, so we've been able to see the shift in how we think about and talk about mental health from the 1980s into the 90s, and then explodes through the 2000s. Let's go back to 1987. What do we know about Prozac? What's it supposed to be doing? And how does it get approved by the FDA?
Well, the story of Prozac is a story of marketing, of course. We're starting to hear from psychiatrists that they have discovered that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the brain, low serotonin. Now, we can go into this. They never made this discovery. And they knew that there was this mechanism of action by fluoxetine in which it blocked the normal reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic neurons, so it ups serotonergic activity. So that gave them a marketing story. They said, we're discovering that that depression is due to too little serotonin. And now we have a drug that fixes that, brings it back into balance. And it's like insulin for diabetes. So that's a marketing message. That is a story of an incredible advance. And next thing you know, fluoxetine is released and it's been a breakthrough medication. You have 60 Minutes. Prozac is put on the cover of magazines, okay, as a breakthrough medication. And it has this very simple soundbite used to sell it. It fixes a chemical imbalance in the brain. And that fits into a larger narrative that we all believe in or not all believe in, but it's of magic bullets and of the advances in medicine and these science and advances in understanding the brain. Now, the problem was, first of all, if you actually talk to the researchers, they would admit at this time that the low serotonin theory of depression wasn't panning out, in fact. That's number one. Number two, if you actually go into the documents, there were all sorts of problems, starting with the animal studies about adverse effects, sort of inducing mania, inducing psychosis was shown in the clinical trials. So much so that if you look at the data in Germany, they concluded that this drug is wholly unfit to be an antidepressant because it, by the way, it did not show to be any more effective in reducing symptoms than the old tricyclics, by the way. If anything, imipramine was better, and it had this serious adverse side effects. But that's not the story that was told to us. The story that was told to us was a story of a great medical advance. We heard about breakthrough medications. And then and we can talk about what were the dual forces behind that storytelling. But then what happens in the 1990s, you get these PR campaigns. Now, the PR campaigns are actually funded by the makers of the SSRIs, starting with Eli Lilly, in which they give money both to the NIMH and to individual doctors who are now working for them, academic psychiatrists with prestigious appointments at prestigious universities. They come to us as professors of psychiatry from prestigious universities, but what was really happening is they were serving as, quote, key opinion leaders or key thought leaders for the drug companies, which means they were making all sorts of money to tout new drugs and build markets for these new drugs. So what happens in the 1990s? They start running PR campaigns to get people to understand in quotes, that depression is it's a biological brain disease. It's not what happens to you. It's not a psychological response to difficulties in life. And it's chronic. Okay, before in 1987, I think it was, or 85, the NIMH did a survey and they asked people, if you're depressed, what will you do? And you know what most people said? Oh, depression will pass with time. It's episodic. And I just need to talk to my friends and maybe my pastor, make changes in my life. And the NIMH and the American Psychiatric Association said, we need a campaign to change that thinking. So people understand that depression is a brain disease, it's chronic, and therefore you need to take antidepressants. And it's a miracle drug. You'll be better than well. You know, that was a book that came out by Peter Kramer, and it says you will be better than well. And here's the most ironic part, in a way. If you look at the data, it wasn't very effective. Fluoxetine had all sorts of adverse effects. And German regulators said this compound is totally unfit as a treatment for depression. What do we hear? Researchers are so great in understanding the brain now. The real worry is we can give you a designer population. In other words, a designer personality, whatever personality you want. If you're shy, we can make you outgoing. And there was even some hand-wringing over, do we really want a population where everyone is always happy all the time? That's how insane this time was. But all you have to see was it was a marketing triumph. And, you know, they did this PR campaigns where they would do screening campaigns to screen for this chronic disease, get this miracle drug. And we changed our thinking. We came to believe that antidepressants fixed a chemical imbalance in the brain.